Even if you go down the road of an ethical argument in support of animal rights, often you'll hit a roadblock with many people with a religious question.
People use religion as a buffet that you just take what suits you and you find loopholes around it.
It's like, oh, I'm so peaceful, I'm so positive. Oh, I'm gonna go eat a hamburger now and pay for a dairy cow to be forcibly artificially inseminated. These things just intuitively seem like the opposite of what spirituality is supposed to capture.
Are humans and animals morally equal?
The way we abuse animals is like a root cause issue that sets us up to discriminate against other human beings. Someone out there who has committed an act of rape, there was a part of that was pleasurable to them. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it, but that doesn't make it right.
I get this so often that no one's stopping you from being vegan, but it's my personal choice.
Your personal choice not so personally includes the oppression of trillions of animals every year.
Is there a compassionate, peaceful, benevolent way to kill an animal? I looked for a long time and I've yet to find one.
All right, guys, I've got two of my favorite troublemakers here today. First up, Daniel Ishay, also known as Lifting Vegan Logic, the guy who somehow makes trolling anti-vegan arguments look like fine art. If you've ever wondered what it's like to combine sarcasm, logic, dark humor, and the ability to stay completely deadpan while dismantling every single excuse in the book, this is your guy. Joining us, we have Kameron Waters, the brain behind Christpiracy, a documentary that's stirring up more conversations than your grandma's church group and ruffling more feathers than a room full of chickens, basically doing God's work. We're diving into everything from ridiculous online debates to big, bold questions that will have you rethinking your last Sunday sermon. Welcome to Sustainability with Shreya, and let's dive in.
Let's do it. Good. Thank you for having us. It's an honor.
So glad this finally worked out. Kameron, in Christpiracy, you portray how there is acceptance and refusal of anti-vegan arguments. Like there's an argument for it and there's also arguments against it. Danny, you also use logic to debate ethics. What's the biggest clash between religion and ethics from a moral consistency point of view?
Yeah, well, for me, I as someone who's more secular, when I speak to people about animal rights, I'm usually covering it from a perspective of logical consistency, doing a kind of internal criticism of people's views. And that can look something like asking people who consume meat if they can justify it in a way that is logically consistent. So that would look something like this. Somebody might say, I think that killing cows for food is ethical. I'll say, okay, do you think killing humans for food is ethical? They'll say no. And I'll say, what is the morally relevant difference that justifies that differential treatment? And they could say something like, oh, it's intelligence. Cows aren't as smart as humans. And then you ask, okay, well, if we had a human that was as smart as or even less smart than a cow, would it be ethical to farm them? And if they say no, that's a logical contradiction, right? And we haven't even talked about my views or anyone, just theirs. And that's how I go about it personally. But Cam can take a much better like religious angle, I would say, than myself, because I'm not as well versed in scripture I guess he is.
Yeah, because religion also both justifies and rejects animal consumption. What's your take on that?
Yeah, well, Christpiracy does take the approach, is there an ethical way to kill an animal? So there is crossover. However, we look at the lens of religion and spirituality because our ethical principles are highly built on the religious culture, the dominant religious culture of our country that we may live in. And so here in the West, it's, Judaism, Christianity, maybe Islam in the East, Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism. But whether you're religious or not, those fundamentals are highly rooted in religious tradition. So, for me, growing up Christian and kind of beginning to ask myself these questions, it was really important for me to understand it through that lens. And I truly feel that most people, even if you go down the road of an ethical argument in support of animal rights or, being compassionate towards animals, often you'll hit a roadblock with many people with a religious question. And so that's what we really try to tackle. So we do the ethical thing, but we go once layer deeper to hit those cultural kind of conversations.
So someone who has a religious argument, do you think you can use logic to convince them, or do you need to use religion? And same with someone who has a logical argument against veganism. Do you think going the spiritual or the religious way, does that help tackle? Or which one has broader impact?
I mean, for me, it's because logic is something I think that underlies all of our thinking. So if somebody personally justifies consuming animals with God said so, I can still use logic to see if they're actually consistent in their view that something is just moral because God says so. And I can do this in the form of asking if God came down tomorrow and was like, it's okay to mass genocide left-handed people, like something absurd like that. They'd have to be okay with that because God says it's right equals it's right is their position. So that's how I navigate people that use scripture and God to justify these things. But someone like Cam is going to more so go into actual scripture and see if there's an actual way to justify eating animals, given everything that you have to work with when reading scripture. I don't know much about it. He does, so that's his forte.
Yeah.
You know?
No, I think you can easily talk to a religious person and use logic and make really, really profound arguments. Whether or not they accept those arguments or are able to follow, it kind of depends on the person. But in fact, I do believe, as antithetical as it may seem to have logic and religion together for certain people, for instance, in the Christian Bible, in the New Testament, the Gospel of John, the opening chapter says, in the beginning was the word, and that Greek word is logos, logic, reason. In the beginning was the logic, the logos. And that, to me, I feel when you get to the root of these issues that can seem spiritual, ethereal, and all of this, it really comes down to like the golden rule principle, which is in all religion, which is do unto others as you would have done unto you. And so there is kind of a base level logic of that, so to speak, like, hey, I want to be free. I want to be healthy. I want to be, I want to minimize suffering for myself. So I should do that to others as well. It's kind of a logical conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
Was the language recently changed from thou shalt not kill to thou shalt not murder?
Well, so in Hebrew, it can be translated kind of both ways. Most people tend to lean towards thou shalt not murder. Actually, thou shalt not kill became predominant because of the King James Bible, which is the most heavily printed translation of the Bible, English translation. But it's a little more accurate, thou shalt not murder. And most people would think, oh, well, that's talking about humans. But in fact, really, it's specifying intentional killing. So this is outside of like maybe self-defense and outside of when you have a premeditated decision to kill something, that's murder. And the irony is that in English, the word murder, etymologically speaking, relates to animals, because the word mur is an old English word or root that means to kill or to harm, and der is small animal. It's the word where the word deer comes from. So funny enough, the word murder actually specifically derives from the perception of killing any living being, including a small animal.
Are humans and animals morally equal?
So that's going to depend on the person you ask. There's definitely some vegans that do think that. I personally don't, but not in that every single human has more moral value than every single animal. For example, I think like an innocent little dog probably has more value than someone like Hitler, whose behavior was tied to so much atrocity and whatnot. But generally speaking, I take a more of like a sentience hierarchy approach, and under the idea that like human beings could have higher levels of sentience than say like a cockroach. If there was a burning building, I wouldn't flip a coin to figure out who to save, right? I would probably save the human being. And that's something that people need to understand when it comes to veganism, that you don't have to necessarily morally equate the value of humans and animals to recognize that animals have what's called sufficient moral value to not be bred, exploited, and killed by the billions and actually trillions when you consider fish for our taste pleasure and whatnot. So, but some vegans will say that they value animals and humans equally, and that's their view. But yeah, I just want to make that clear that you don't have to have this view in order to come to an agreement with vegan ethics.
Because some people might argue that we're trying to give them the same rights that humans have.
Right.
Yeah.
So I take a more of a logical extension kind of view. So I think that animal rights should be a logical extension of human rights. So what that would look like is there's certain human beings that don't have the intelligence due to maybe some like really severe mental disability to drive a car or to vote. So those rights aren't really afforded to those people, just like with animals. So we're not saying like give the right to drive or to vote to animals. We're saying give them the right to not be subject to being mass farmed for burgers or pizza or whatever it may be. And that's something that you can easily recognize when you just understand what like logical extension means in the context that he's used it. So yeah.
What's your take on humans and animals being morally equal?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that it is actually relevant how equal we are depending on which metric, because there's so many different ways you can go with that. Again, going back to the scriptural side of it, which is, our specialty and focus in Christpiracy, a lot of religious people that come from a Western religious ideology will use the term dominion, that, man has dominion over animals and that man is specifically made in the image of God. Everybody has varying understandings of what that means, but typically it means something like our ability to reason, create, some of these kind of things was endowed upon us. And clearly animals don't have the exact same capacity that we do in that sense. And I think it's fine for Christians to believe that. I just don't think that if the idea is if we have some kind of superior quality, what does that mean? What do we use that for? And so if we have this superior ability to reason and to have a certain empathy and all of these kind of things, that should lead us to using that for good for the animal kingdom. And I think the best way that we can do that is through, again, using another spiritual term, that stewardship. Dominion truly means stewardship. It doesn't mean that we have the right to, some authoritarian, overreach, tyrannical kind of thing. And in fact, the irony is in the Bible, people use dominion a lot, but they fail to realize that dominion is first granted in Genesis, the first book of the Bible. When the world is created, God gives man dominion over the earth and over the animals. But ironically, the next verse, that's verse 128 in Genesis, and then 129, he prescribes a plant-based diet. So it's as our professor in our film, Dr. Andrew Lindsay, famously says, herb eating dominion is hardly a license for tyranny. So it's pretty clear that, dominion is more actually a stewardship. It's guiding and shaping and creating more and more harmony through our intellect.
I'd also just like to say that even people that aren't vegan or meat eaters already kind of exhibit this idea that animals have what I call sufficient moral value, such that it's unethical to just kill them for no reason. For example, you have a family with a mom and a dad, a daughter, and a dog. Let's say there's a burning building. The dad's probably going to save his daughter over the dog because he morally values the daughter over the dog. That doesn't mean that in a context where there's no burning building and no one's in danger, that you get to just go up to your dog and slice their throat and consume their flesh. So that's an example, I think, in practice that people already kind of exhibit, and there's no requirement of equal moral consideration for the dog and the daughter in this case to make that decision.
How do you both individually tackle statements such as God put animals on earth for us to eat them or for us to have dominion over them? As you said, the word's been misconstrued, but also God wouldn't have made them as tasty if we weren't made to eat them. How do you tackle questions about God and animals and the fact that we're meant to consume them?
Yeah, I mean, the tasty thing is just like, you can make that argument about somebody who finds human flesh tasty and then say, why would we not be meant to eat humans if God made them so tasty? So that's kind of I think an absurd position. And also, I think when somebody invokes God as the justification for harming others, I'm going to want to have evidence for something like God's existence. I mean, I could say the same thing about my left shoe. Like the other day, my left shoe told me that we have the right to just do whatever we want to animals or something like that. And I mean, presumably people are going to want to have evidence that my shoe came down to me and said something, so that's like using something that is immeasurable, that we can't empirically verify, to justify harming others that we can empirically verify and whose suffering we can empirically verify is something. It's just absurd, and there's so many angles you can use if you were to use that logic in other places, and to justify the worst atrocities you can think of. So that's my take.
That's an agnostic point of view. What about yours?
Yeah, well, I mean, the taste pleasure thing is interesting. I think it's ironic. A lot of people think that those that don't eat animals somehow completely abhor the taste of flesh. I know that there's a lot of people that will admit, including myself, like I liked the taste of meat when I was eating it.
Me too.
I ate a lot of barbecue. I was a butcher at a barbecue restaurant. I fished, I hunted, I did all of that. But I didn't stop because of, the taste is not justifiable for the action and what's being done. Similarly, like I'm sure someone out there who has committed an act of rape, there was a part of that was pleasurable to them. Otherwise they wouldn't do it, but that doesn't make it right. So these kind of things we have to transcend, these types of sensory, selfish pleasures. And I feel too, with the idea of dominion in animals being here for our use from a spiritual sense, it's just a gross misreading of the text. I think that for a long time, humans have used those things to justify their actions, but it's only because they haven't really understood the depth of the text. And the farther back you go to the original root of those writings and the peoples that transcribe those writings, as we do in Christpiracy, you'll see they meant something completely different. And that's what Christpiracy is revealing.
What do you do when people use religion to justify eating animals? When, they say that my religion permits consumption of animals, or we eat meat because it's part of our tradition or ritual, a festival, whatever that might be. How do you tackle that?
Well, that one's actually pretty easy, because the funny thing is if you ask most Christians, does God command or demand that we eat meat? Most will say no. So then you can kind of shelve the religious argument and say, okay, well then is it necessary? And then you can have all kinds of logical arguments. You can have environmental, health, wherever it goes. But at the end of the day, if they don't feel their God commands it, then if there's an alternative, then wouldn't God be happy with that too? And what is the most compassionate? What is the most benevolent? These attributes that we attribute to God or Jesus or our, Buddha, they're the most compassionate, the most benevolent, the most peaceful. Is there a compassionate, peaceful, benevolent way to kill an animal, to farm an animal? I looked for a long time in the pursuit of the filming of Christpiracy, and I've yet to find one. So, I just feel that these religious traditions, you can, if they believe it's commanded, then you have to have a whole other conversation, like I said, where it's a gross misreading of the text. You can get into translations, mistranslations of specific verses. But even like Islam, the concept of halal and haram, right? Halal just means permissible. It means it's permissible. It passed the test of being admissible, but it doesn't mean obligatory. So.
Mm-hmm.
You had a video why spiritual people hate vegans.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
You want to talk about that and the clash between spirituality and also ethical responsibility? And then that begs the question, can you be spiritual and eat meat?
Yeah. So when it comes to spirituality, I mean, the term is quite ambiguous. People use it in a variety of ways. But typically what I see from people who claim to be spiritual is that they live a life that is devout to spreading some kind of what they would say, like, positive energy or, positive vibrations, terms that I don't, as somebody who's more like evidence-based and into science, I don't totally know what those things mean, but what I gather is that they want to do good in the world and just promote well-being and the promotion. Yeah, whatever. So I just don't, when you look at the killing of animals for food, and you look at the fact that, like, when it comes to nutrition science, we know that we don't need to do this to prosper, to be healthy, etc. And you take that information and think about, okay, well, if we don't need it, then what is the actual reason you're consuming it? It is probably going to come down to pleasure. And how can somebody justify, who's like so spiritual and wants to make the world so positive, whatever, killing animals at a fraction of their lifespan when they have so many more years to live, so many more years of well-being to experience, when you just simply don't need to? It's like, oh, I'm so peaceful, I'm so positive. Oh, I'm going to go eat a hamburger now and just go and pay for a dairy cow to be forcibly or artificially inseminated, to be separated from her mother, to be killed when she's no longer profitable. It's like these things just intuitively seem like the opposite of what spirituality is supposed to capture, when these spiritual, yogi types are like, I'm so positive, blah, blah, so that's how I think of it. I mean,
yeah, I mean, I think there's a few ways, spirituality can go. There's definitely the Instagram version, which is a little bit more maybe leaning in the narcissistic and a little bit more performative, I think.
Delusions of grandeur.
Yeah. There's also, I think rooted cultural tradition that's ancient and old and maybe has, textual references behind it and communal readings, observances, and all these kinds of things. But again, when you're getting into that, there's a whole religious argument with scripture, but then there's a whole separate argument that's just culture. And so I think taste pleasure is a huge one for people. I also think cultural tradition is massive in the sense that one of the scariest things biologically for a human is to be ostracized from the tribe. It's like an ancient, because speaking like if we were in a tribe, 1,000 years ago, if you get ostracized from the tribe, you're probably going to die because they don't the resources fending for yourself without, others around you and certain perceivable threats and all these kind of, it's an innate, deep human thing. So I think that people don't realize they're fighting their biology sometimes if they're stepping outside of the cultural norm to do something, and people start saying, oh, you're different. Why are you doing that? It doesn't make sense. What about this? It can be really scary for people to leave that behind. So I think a lot of that comes into play as well.
Yeah, I'd also just say that appealing to culture to justify the harm of others is interesting, because there's plenty of things that are done culturally that people object to, like like female genital mutilation, and culture. Like theoretically, any sort of practice can be cultural. If you have a set of group of people who do a certain action for a set amount of time, we're going to say like, okay, that's like a cultural thing. And if, abusing children was cultural, people wouldn't be like, it's part of their culture, we should respect it. And same with animals, like if some part of some cultures is literally the systematic, brutal murder of animals over and over and over, because meat is great, like in America, for example, right? But we don't look at these as justifications. There could be cannibalistic cultures that practice killing innocent human beings and maybe even sacrificing them against their will. But we're not going to be like, oh, but it's their culture, we have to respect it. It's like, sorry to be.
That's exactly
like,
what it is.
Yeah, sorry to be like blunt, but like, why should we respect something that literally includes disrespecting others and ending their lives? Like, so that's how I would do it.
And it's pretty clear to see when you use these amazing hypothetical examples of like cannibalistic tribes and everything. But then it gets really interesting when you realize that literally right now as we're speaking, there's cultures of dog eating people, and we
people are enraged.
Yeah, right. So we bring that up in the film in Christpiracy as well, because Buddhists, in particular that live in Asia and in these same areas, they have these particular justifications. Buddhism is one of the closest religions to having this pure, blatant animal rights ideal at its core, because the first precept of Buddhism is to not harm or kill any sentient being. So yeah, exactly, ahimsa. So, but yet you'll have Buddhists that will use all these other justifications, which we explore in the film, where maybe I won't do it myself, but if someone else has done it and they're serving it to me as a host or whatever, then maybe I'm obliged to consume that because I don't want to offend the host, because the karma of offending the host may be worse than actually the animal that's already been killed, and these kind of like loopholes and everything. So we, in the film, ask one of the Buddhists, well, if a host served you dog, would you eat it? And he's like, well, no, of course I wouldn't eat it. And then we asked, well, wouldn't that offend the host? And he's like, well, I've never even heard of dogs being eaten before. And ironically, it's a Buddhist nation where most of the dog eating happens. And so that's just such a really in-your-face example of, does that make you uncomfortable that people are eating dogs? Okay, well, what's the difference? It's literally an animal, and they're butchering it and consuming it. So what's the difference? Danny and many in the kind of like ethical, logical community that push really good arguments there is this name the trait argument. And there's one that's like, what's the difference between humans? But what's the difference between a dog and a cow? I mean, that's really,
Right.
there's like, it's way harder to name a trait there.
Yeah. And some people might name the trait like, dogs here are, they're brought up as pets, but it's like, okay, so, well, there's also cultures where they're brought up as food. Is it ethical to like, if I take a dog over here, but now he's over in this location, so it's okay to just slice your throat and eat them? It's like, do you sincerely believe that, So, any sort of like trait they name in response to the name the trait argument, which essentially is just asking somebody, what is the morally relevant difference between, say, like humans and animals, or it could even be cows and dogs, such that it's ethical to kill one and not the other?
What do people come up with?
Yeah, so some people may say something like intelligence, like I think I said earlier, and you might say like, what do you mean by intelligence? That's a very ambiguous term. They may say humans have a sense of tomorrow, cows do not. And then you say, okay, well, what about human beings who show no greater degree of having a sense of tomorrow than cows? Do we get to farm them? And in order to be like logically consistent, they have to say yes. But for the average person that I've spoken to who's not a psychopath, they end up saying no. And I mean, that's a great thing. I'm happy that people don't think that it's ethical to farm mentally handicapped people just because they don't have a sense of tomorrow. It's an absurd and psychopathic thing to even say. I do think some people who do say yes are just trying to come across as logically consistent. But if you were to actually like break down what they actually think in their mind, they don't. I've had some situations where I would straight up say, do you really believe that? Or are you just trying to be consistent? And they instinctually just laugh like nervously. And they're like, okay, yeah, no, I don't think that. I'm like, okay, good. Because that'd be terrifying if you genuinely did. So yeah.
Because I don't know if people use religion as a buffet that you just take what suits you and you find loopholes around it. It's not like they follow the entire doctrine, right? It just,
Absolutely.
I pick what I want and then stick by that, and I'm just going to follow whatever suits my preferences. Have you come across that?
Absolutely. And I feel, specifically speaking from my own religious background, Christianity is one of the greatest examples of that, because often now that I've been on this journey and I've explored so deeply into the scriptures to really understand what the truth is in regards to this argument, whenever I present any one of those findings to someone who maybe doesn't agree with those findings, they'll say, oh, well, you're cherry picking to support your beliefs. That's what's happening. You're taking that one verse and you're cherry picking. But the irony is, if you look from the beginning to the end of the scripture of the Bible, let's just really quickly, in the beginning in the Bible, it's the Garden of Eden. There's no slaughter, killing, or death of animals. That's plain as day. Not a single Christian, to the most fundamentalist Bible-beating Christian, will disagree with that. Also, the scripture says the end of the story ends in a prophetic kingdom of heaven, where again, there's no slaughter, there's no killing, there's peace. It's the peaceable kingdom, right? So that's the beginning and in the end of the story. And all throughout, if you really understand how to read the scripture correctly, you see a story of humanity with all of its flaws, trying to deal with maintaining or returning to that ideal. And they make all kinds of mistakes, but then they have prophets and people who come through and preach these amazing returns to that ideal. All of the prophets rejected the animal sacrificial ritual, which essentially back in those days was the slaughterhouse. It was the way that cities provided meat to their cultures, because much different than now, it was more in your face. And so they made the sacred act out of it. And then they used those particular entrails and everything to perform rituals to the gods and everything. So what I find is, when I often return that back to people and say, well, you're saying I'm cherry picking, but I would challenge you that I think you're cherry picking to use the scripture to justify eating animals. Because if the beginning of the story starts here and it ends here, then that to me sounds like a pretty conclusory, most theses start with, here's what the thesis is, let's explore all the in and outs, and then we end with the theses again. That's the thesis. So you're cherry picking this internal data about just historical narrative, and it's not the real depth of the actual meaning of the story.
Why do people get so defensive? Whether you're coming up with an intellectual argument or logical argument or a religious argument, the walls are so high up that people almost get defensive immediately, and they feel offended. Where does that defense mechanism or the offense come from?
Well, I think people generally don't want to come across as looking like a bad person. And there's many people who proclaim they're animal lovers. They have a dog at home or or a cat or something like that. And when veganism is brought up as like as a philosophy, and somebody even hears like, oh, I'm a vegan, and then they go, oh, why are you vegan? And I say, oh, because I object to the animal abuse that occurs for animal products to exist. They are indirectly kind of being told that they're supporting animal abuse. I didn't say it directly, but like if you're not vegan, like that's what you're doing. And now they want to kind of like cover up that kind of bad image with something like a justification, like, well, actually, I need to eat meat for protein or something like that, or for B12 or iron. And it's also, I think, why vegans are so made fun of in the media. I think a lot of the time making vegans look bad kind of helps reinforce this idea that, being vegan is kind of like dumb, and I'm not a bad person for paying for the systematic, brutal murder of animals, every single day or whatever, or whenever you go to the grocery store or restaurants. And there's also like, I theorize it's probably because like very viral stories also they're just spread everywhere about one particular vegan who was on like a fruitarian diet who didn't consume water directly for like 5 or 6 years, that recently passed away. This actually happened, and everyone's going crazy about it. And they'll share like, yeah, see, like veganism and the diet that comes under veganism is inherently deficient. When it's like, why don't we talk about the vegans who consume water on top of an actual well-balanced diet that's a mixture of cooked and raw foods with adequate supplementation? But if we talked about that and the research supporting vegans who consume that diet, those people are going to be faced with the fact that they don't, in fact, need to consume animal products to be healthy, and they are most likely just consuming them because it tastes good. And as we discussed already, pleasure should not be viewed as a justification for violating the rights of somebody else.
Yeah, and I think defense mechanisms are somewhat natural. Again, we have an innate, inbuilt thing to protect ourselves for a variety of reasons, and some of them are good reasons. But just speaking for myself, when I was coming out of hunting, fishing, working at a barbecue restaurant, and all of that, my defenses were a lot more around the taste and just kind of more so, at that time, I wasn't really aware of these arguments around protein. How am I going to get enough protein and this and that? I did have a little bit of that because I was, younger, and I was looking to build muscle in a particular way and all of that. But mostly it was just that it was what I was used to. And so when I first started transitioning into this, it was because I did a Daniel fast, which is this biblical diet where, and Daniel here, his namesake,
did my fast.
I did Daniel's
Sure.
fast, which is, the scripture says that this prophet Daniel, when he was enslaved in Babylon, refused to eat the rich foods of the king, which were meat, and he ate only vegetables and water, it says, and he was stronger, wiser, and more adept in every way than anyone in the kingdom, much like Daniel here.
I don't think I'm a prophet, by the way, just to be clear.
Just got that glow around you.
Yeah.
So I did that diet because, or a fast, should I say, because it became kind of like, in my culture with Protestantism, it's kind of like Lent for Catholics. So it was something we observed as a family together. But once I did it, I felt amazing. I started to feel those benefits that it says in the Bible. And then over time, I kept that. But the hardest part when I first did it, because the Daniel fast is the diet part, but then there's also kind of reading scripture, meditation, prayer, all these things that you do together. And the diet part was kind of the harder one. I was like, oh man, this is going to be kind of hard to do that. But then I ended up loving it. So that defense mechanism of feeling like it's just something you're not used to and everything is inbuilt. But I think it goes really back to the cultural element big time too, because I think when people are getting so defensive, it's kind of alluding to what Daniel was saying. It's like, somewhere deep in there, I would almost sum it up like, so you're saying my mom is wrong? You're saying my dad is wrong? You're saying that my whole lineage, whether they're actually consciously thinking that or not, it's like, we were raised this way. So it's almost, you have to look back and say, wow, like it makes you feel like, okay, everyone's wrong. Therefore, does that mean everyone, including my own family, are like bad people? And then when it comes
everything,
right, and when it comes to that, I think it's no one's bad people. In fact, it's the system itself that needs the finger pointing, because so many people eat, live, and continue to do this way because of an ancient system that involves money, profits, and bottom line. Even back again, like I said, with our film Christpiracy, one of the big things that we reveal is that this temple system and the slaughter are all connected in with an elite class that was pushing a particular product basically on people, and any threats to those profits are not good. So everyone has this programmed responses, the viral videos nowadays, but maybe it was commercials back in the day, the Burger King commercials, this and that, with tons of money behind it, reinforcing the idea that, oh, it's okay and it's good for me to do this. Yeah.
And it's so ingrained that people fight against it. Every time I bring this up in India, and you've covered India quite a bit in the documentary as well, people allude to Krishna, people allude to how it's okay to offer it to gods if our gods accept it and if our monks consume it, and if, religious leaders say that it's okay to do that. They almost use that as a justification for why they continue doing what they do.
Right.
Which is super interesting, because they wouldn't stand any argument against it. You can't use logic, you can't use religion, because it's almost like you're anti-religious or you're going against their religion. Do you ever hear that you're anti-Christian for bringing up what you bring up?
Well, back when I first really, like I said, I did the Daniel fast, and then I kind of became awake to this question in general because I was feeling amazing the way that I was eating. But then I was like, okay, this book of Daniel, which talks about eating only vegetables, I had never even heard that part of the story when I was a kid. Because when you grow up in church, they tell you like these almost like, Sunday school bedtime stories about Daniel survived the lion's den and he this and he that, but they never really mentioned the vegetable eating part. They always skip over that. And in fact, one funny piece to that is the way I learned a lot of my Bible stories as a kid was through a cartoon called VeggieTales. There was there's an animated like cartoons that tell Bible stories, and anyone who's a Christian that's listening to this will know what I'm talking about. It was really, really famous. And yeah, they animated a pickle or a cucumber and a tomato as characters to tell these stories. But the irony is the first ever VeggieTales VHS I had, for anyone who knows what that is, it's the way we used to watch movies back in the day. But my first ever VeggieTales episode that I owned was Daniel. It was on Daniel. And it told the whole story of Daniel, but skipped over the vegetable eating part. And it was vegetables telling the story. So that shows you that level of cognitive dissonance to avoid that part of the conversation. So all that to say, once I became privy to this part of the Bible, I said, well, is there anywhere else in the Bible that kind of talks about that? And first thing I come to is the very beginning of the story in the Garden of Eden, where humans are prescribed a diet of plants. And I'm like, wow, I never really had that focused on too much either. And so I just started to explore, what is this thread and what does the Bible really say about all this? And obviously at a certain point, I brought some of those thoughts to my community. And in fact, even when I didn't bring it to the community, it would just so happen to be that after, say, I played drums at the church and everything, after church or after a rehearsal, we would all have a little meal together, and people would be like, well, why you're not going to eat your chicken sandwich or what, you're not. And I would explain to them what I was experiencing and going through and questioning. And then they would look at me as if it was like I was believing something different or going down a bad path by even exploring this. And so that really was a big driver for me to go down the path and research it all the way up until the point that I met Kip, the co-director, and it centered on this question for me, which again, some Christian nostalgic lore, the WWJD bracelets. When I was 8 years old, I had a Bible study that was centered around these bracelets that say WWJD, which means what would Jesus do? And we would study Bible verses. And if you would ask, like, say, my friends on the playground, we would have this little booklet and we'd say, oh, if you found a wallet laying on the ground on the playground, what would Jesus do? Would he keep the wallet for himself? Would he turn it in? These types of things. And if you got it was an ethical kind of moral compass. Yeah, it was a moral compass. Yeah. And if you got it right, then I would pass out a WWJD bracelet to my people in my Bible study. But it's something that's always stuck with me. And that's the central thesis of Christpiracy, really. Is there a ethical or spiritual way to kill an animal? Or just to sum it up, what would Jesus do? Because most people see Jesus, regardless of religion, just as this figure that represents benevolence, compassion, truth, high ethical standard. So yeah, when I started asking what would Jesus do when it comes to eating animals, and if he did, how would he kill an animal? it creates a lot of interesting rub. And like you said, kind of feelings in people as if maybe there's something antithetical of their religion with that, even just that question alone.
Was there a threat of emasculation? Because you're talking about hunting, butchering, doing all of these things before, and then both of you turning vegan, but you also doing that while being a fitness trainer. Is there like a degree of like sexism or just feeling emasculated? Because so many times veganism is alluded to. There's more women who are vegan, of course, like even in the general vegan population. How do you see that dance between masculinity and being vegan?
Yeah, I mean, I think for sure in America, like hunting and meat is categorized as something manly, and ironically, I mean, it depends on what people mean when they utter the word masculinity. For me, it has something to do with protecting the vulnerable and the innocent, and that's what veganism is. And I think there's also something to do with just like nutritional myths around like soy and phytoestrogens. People think that the estrogens in soy are somehow mammalian. They're actually phyto, so they're not the same estrogens that you find in say like cow's milk, for example. And there's even there's research showing that there is no like significant degree of reduction or anything in like male hormones when you consume soy, and from the isoflavones that are within it and stuff. So there's like probably the nutritional aspect of things, and then there's just like the cultural reinforcement that meat and hunting is what a man does. And it's just ironically, you talk to any vegan male who's ethically inclined, they'll define masculinity to you as something to do with protecting the innocent and the vulnerable, which I would argue many people that are not vegan understand when it comes to like children and like women or whatever. But for some reason, when it comes to animals, the more vulnerable and not as intelligent they are, the more we have the right to like exploit them and all of this, which to me is just backwards and just a really corrupt version of what masculinity actually is. So
yeah, and I feel if you go all the way back in history, as far as we can go, a little bit of the history itself becomes there's some holes in it, but essentially there's some really great authors that have kind of talked about the rise of like the connection of masculinity and meat all the way back to like as far as 6000 BC or so, when the advent of agriculture even started. Because before that, it was, more tribal cultures that were scavenger gathering and everything. And essentially the idea is that, the women typically stayed back with the children, with the tribe, and maybe gathered berries and grew some grains and some of these things close by. But men went out and hunted to bring back, or maybe even so, that's a little bit of an exaggeration. It might have been scavenging a lot of the time, because hunting is incredibly inefficient, calorically speaking, and depending on what kind of tools you have and everything. So the man brings home the bacon, as they say, that kind of famous phrase. And there's this idea that maybe at a certain point in that time, because it was survival, women were the ones that gave birth and brought life, which is such a powerful, mystical, mysterious thing that continues the tribe moving forward. And so to balance that out, men began to take a lot of pride in bringing home death, bringing home the killed animal to supply and provide and all those kind of things. But then this kind of weird obsession with being able to take life. Women give life, men take life and provide, but the idea is that's all developed through survival scenarios, and really once we have the ability to grow and have alternatives, as Danny said, that same kind of brute strength, maybe different emotional capacities that males have over females, that, maybe we can compartmentalize our emotions a little bit better, et cetera. We're able to move forward and less fear going ahead and protecting and, just being more of a warrior for the vulnerable, not to kill them, but to protect them. And then I think just, again, it comes down to our society and the meat medical, military industrial complex that's been built off the backs of this whole system that we have now. It has to keep going in the way that it keeps going, so those profits keep rolling in. Is to push the propaganda that it is masculine to eat meat, and it hits that innate thing within us. And like I said earlier, Burger King commercials. There's a Burger King commercial that we literally highlight in Christpiracy that shows how, a bunch of dudes busting their way out of a Burger King saying, "I am man, hear me roar, I eat meat," yada, yada, yada. And, it's just playing to this kind of primal thing that I understand where it comes from. But when there's another option, isn't it so much better to use your strength and vitality to protect rather than to take life? So that's kind of how I see it. Yeah.
There's also the idea that, people think that having muscles is masculine, which, maybe that's the case. But people that study sports science have been telling us for years that an increased protein intake is how you gain more muscle. And people often associate protein with animal products, meat, dairy, and eggs, not knowing that every whole plant-based food contains all of the non-essential amino acids. And I mean, that's why I'm here stronger than I was as a meat eater. Not to say that wouldn't have happened or my strength wouldn't have gotten to this point if I continued eating meat, but that it hasn't impeded my progress in any way. Mm-hmm. And I get like 150 to 200 grams of protein per day. And there's even research on this where they take two different groups and they equate protein, except one group is consuming plant protein, one's consuming animal protein. And in terms of muscle hypertrophy, which is essentially just like muscle growth and strength, there's no statistically significant difference between the groups. So I would say that the masculinity thing often is tied to muscle, and people doesn't occur to them that plants also have protein. That's why we're asked all the time, hey, where do you get your protein? When it's like, well, from plants. But
that's where the animals get it from, right? The animals literally get it from the plants. They would
die without it. So.
And that's the irony of the whole soy boy thing to me. Is just like, don't you realize that most of the beef you eat has been fed soy? Right. They're eating that. And the funny thing about soy too, again, just circling it back to the industry propaganda. If you go back in time to I think it was late 80s, early 90s, there was a write-up that was proliferated around like crazy called the killer bean. It was a news article that people talked about, and it's really, if you follow it, if you trace it back, it's the inception of the idea of soy being bad for males. Mm-hmm. And they pushed this idea that the phytoestrogens were going to disrupt the hormonal systems of humans, and that it was detrimental for males and all of these things. It was funded by the dairy industry. That era of the 80s into the early 90s is when soy milk started crushing it in the market. More and more people were adopting and doing that because people are lactose intolerant, whether they're vegan or not ethically. People realize that there is a kind of allergy to milk, to dairy products, especially with the lactose intolerance. It causes a lot of mucus, all these things. They were moving towards it for baby formula, all of that. So the industry got threatened by that, and they actually funded this killer bean study to make people feel scared of eating soy and scared of, reducing their milk intake.
It's just funny because if they're talking about phytoestrogen and soy, and that the dairy industry, they're the ones that are like literally disseminating mammalian estrogens to people. We're mammals, we're not plants. So it's just,
I know. That's why I like to say the antithesis of the soy boy is the milk boy. Which one do you want to be?
Right.
Have you watched Live to 100? The Netflix documentary? They go around areas where people live up to 100 years. And one of the factors why they live up to 100 is because they consume plant-based diets.
Yeah, I think traditionally, like plant predominant diets seem to be what are most associated with longevity. Whether it's a Mediterranean, even pescatarian diets, which include fish, they're considered plant predominant. And then same with the vegan diets. Of course, I have ethical issues with the animal product aspect of the Mediterranean and the pescatarian diet, but there's one thing that is there on all three diets, and that's the plant predominance of them. So.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of logical fallacies, because I'm sure you both come across that quite often, and when we did the screening of Christpiracy at Harvard yesterday, you've both been at Harvard for the last couple of days, one of the most prestigious universities in the world. What are the most common logical fallacies you come across, especially the one that you got asked yesterday, which is it happens in nature? Lions kill each other, animals kill each other. So if that violence is acceptable in nature, what we're doing is natural.
Yeah, lions though, that's the big one. You can take that one. Go for it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's called the appeal to nature fallacy, which is essentially to say that an action is right because it is natural, and there's plenty of things that are natural that we don't consider right. For example, I think in biology that it's called forced mating or rape, which happens in the wild. That's natural, but we don't go around saying, oh, I get to rape people because it's natural. Animals rape people, so why can't I? There's also infanticide, which is like literally killing your children. We're not, imagine being in court and saying, but Your Honor, lions kill their kids, so I have the right to kill my child. It's natural. It's just an insane thing. We touched on the appeal to culture fallacy as well earlier, and the idea that we should be preserving things that are natural is just so bizarre. I mean, parasites are natural. We do things to mitigate the damage they can do to us. We were drinking naturally contaminated water for years. Now we drink cleaner water, but it's natural. We should be doing it. Like, of course not, right? So there's also that. And I'd also argue that the meat that people are even consuming nowadays is not natural. These animals are the product of artificial selection and artificial insemination. So to say that you consume meat because it's natural, but the meat you're consuming is the product of something artificial it just sounds like it just doesn't make any sense. So,
yeah. Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of, I mean, if we're staying in fallacies, I think there's a lot of straw manning too. Quite often there's these ideas that are built by those who consume animals in creating this idea of what a vegan is or what that argument is. Or like I said, in the spiritual side, if you get into the scriptures and everything, creating this, oh, you're cherry picking and all of these kinds of things. And it's just building a straw man. And, it's something that someone from my position wouldn't even say. It's much more nuanced or whatever, but it's easier to attack that than to actually deal with the true facts at hand.
You both talk about things that might be considered controversial. What was the most surprising thing you uncovered in the process, both of your journeys, that was like, oh, this is the biggest lie I've ever been sold, or I can't believe this is real, and that I've been conditioned to, this for such a long time? What was that moment?
Well, I've heard people say that like animal farming is necessary. We need to do it just like to maintain the soil fertility and things like that. And it's just so funny to hear anything to do with sustainability and animal agriculture, because animal agriculture it is the most unsustainable way of farming that I can personally think of. I mean, we take up like near 3/4 of our agricultural land for animal farming and get around like 15 to 20% of our calories from it. And then the remaining 25% or 18%, I don't have the exact numbers on me, but gets the rest of the calories from plant foods, and it's like 70 something percent. It's just ridiculous to ever even imply. And the land use is a joke, and grass-fed beef is also something that people advocate for, when it could take upwards of 80% more land than conventional animal agriculture. And it's interesting because in the case of grass-fed, free-range beef versus, say, a conventional beef, there's actually something happening where people will advocate for it because it's more sustainable, because it's more ethical. Like that the cows are treated better before they're killed. But from an environmental perspective, it's actually worse because you're taking up more land. Ironically, factory farming is actually better for the environment than grass-fed in terms of land use and resource use. Animals take a longer time to get to slaughter weight. There's more land being used because they're not crammed into factory farms, and because they take a longer time to get to slaughter weight, they have more time to emit methane. So there's just nothing. There's nothing good about either in the case of like ethics anyway. Like, there's of course that even though the cow is treated nicely, you're still taking their life when they have so many more years to live. And that's why, and in my opinion, plant agriculture actually addresses both issues, in that we're not taking up so much land, and we're also not breeding and exploiting trillions of animals every year.
Did you see this video the other day that grass-fed cows, they weren't really feeding on the grass, there was a pile of grass that was being dumped on top of their heads.
Yeah, people also don't think about how grass doesn't grow in the winter in a lot of places, so you actually have to end up like gathering or harvesting crops that send to various cattle farms. So there's also that.
And unless it says grass finished,
every
single grass-fed cow is, whether winter or not, is finished on grain, because they have to fatten them up because they don't have the same weight and capacity that fully grain-fed cows do. So I went to, for Christpiracy, one of the most prestigious grass-fed pasture raised farms, and they feed them tons of grain, especially at the end of their life to fatten them up. So it's just a big marketing word. It's a buzzword: grass-fed, pasture-raised, regenerative, all of these things. It's a feel-good label to put on something to make it a little bit easier to consume it. And I think too, the interesting thing about the kind of ethical connotation of something like that, people get it in their head that these animals are free roaming and they're doing this and doing that. That's questionable too, because I've seen what some of this free roaming actually is, and it's not as it's more confined than you would realize. Like, again, one of the most prestigious farms, I went there, they're moving these cows around with electric fences, and I literally saw a baby cow get caught on the electrical fence and being shocked continuously.
Wow.
Albeit it's maybe for, 10 minutes or less until the people can come get it out. But still, it's like, that's not natural. If you want to talk about natural for the animal, same thing with the chickens. They're roaming on grass, but they're moving them around in these big cages that kind of cover them so they don't get sun on them still and everything. And so it's even those terms, they're not really accurate, but let's say they were. Let's say these cows and chickens and pigs were all freely roaming and they had no idea that they were a part of a farming operation. But then one day that farmer that comes and is their friend and looks after them and cares for them and develops a relationship with them, because we know these animals have relational capacity. A lot of them do find kind of biological benefit from the idea of being shepherded. They have someone or something they can look to as a consistent thing. And that one thing or that one person comes back and slaughters them. It's the story of Hansel and Gretel. It's almost worse, I would argue, than a factory farming scenario, because they've had a taste of this beautiful life that they've lived, and then the one who's provided it for them turns around and kills them. It's like Hansel and Gretel when she's fattening up the kids and giving them all these candy and loving on them, and then one day she pops them in the oven. That's why it's such a twisted child's tale, And so in some ways, I think factory farmed animals, it's almost like, I wouldn't say more compassionate, but there's something about it where I would imagine that these animals are kind of maybe ready to be out of that scenario, and death is maybe a relief, for them, but not for the pasture-raised, grass-fed animal. It's a horrific, shocking betrayal.
What do you think of sacrificial animals that get sacrificed for religious purposes?
Yeah, well, that's where it all began. So that's the root of it. And that's one of my biggest passions, is to help people understand and wake people up to the fact that animals are still being sacrificed everywhere all around the world. I think there's a lot of people, especially in Western religion, like Christianity, because they see Jesus and Christianity coming to end that sacrificial ritual, which, again, ironically is missed by people. Well, why would Jesus be associated with ending animal sacrificial ritual? Maybe he cared about animals in a certain kind of way and didn't want them to be harmed and suffering, and therefore maybe it's a valid question of whether or not he would support consuming them, which we can get into more. But basically, yeah, I think all around the world, there's these crazy animal sacrificial rituals, and people have these cultural traditions where they feel like they're doing something good. But then when you go and you ask them, like I, went to India, and we went to Kolkata to the Kalighat temple. That was the first ever animal sacrifice I ever saw. And I mean, it's horrific. It just, you can feel the energy and the you love these words, the energy and the vibration. Right. No, but you could literally feel the intensity of this, almost like, dare I say, voodoo, black magic kind of thing, where they're banging these drums and the goats are screaming, and you can't distinguish the screaming of the goats between like children who are there screaming because they're seeing what's happening. There's blood everywhere. And they're burning the incense and they sacrifice the goat. And then you're like, oh my God, this is horrific. Why are they doing this? And then you go and you ask someone, okay, you just sacrificed the goat. We interviewed some people. Why did you sacrifice it? And I expected some beautiful scripture from, the Vedas or something. Oh, because my son has an exam this week and I want him to get a good grade, or I'm trying to make sure my mortgage, like these kinds of things are why they're sacrificing them, because they see it as like a luck bizarre thing.
And this is the Hindu community.
Yeah, Hindu community, but not just pointing out Hindus. I mean, it happens in Islam with Eid.
Yeah.
Christians and Jewish heritage, they're all trying to sacrifice these red heifers in Israel right now. There's this idea or this push. My own community, the evangelical Christians, people don't realize they're pumping hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars into this effort to sacrifice these red heifers to what they feel is going to bring about the end times. If you don't know about it, look it up. It's crazy. Just type in red heifers on Google and it'll come up. But yes, this idea that that the gods or God requires the death and suffering of something else to bring about fortune or to bring about, I guess, repentance for your own sin, these kind of things. So what people don't realize, though, is that is the root of the current animal agriculture that we have, because the first systems of the world of routinely raising, killing, slaughtering animals in a mechanistic way started in temples, because in the cities, like I said, it wasn't. Nowadays, this all happens behind closed doors in the slaughterhouse. You can't see. People are considered terrorists if they go in under the Patriot Act to document these kind of things. But back then, people were more often slaughtering animals in these ritualistic ways. And the reason why they were doing that, there's one of the interviewees from our film, Jim Mason, wrote a book called Unnatural Order, and it builds upon some of the concepts from Germs, Guns, and Steel of Jared Diamond, which is this idea that this sacrificial ritual developed out of a sense of guilt.
So I have a question that occurred to me like 5 minutes ago, and it's going to be structured in kind of an unconventional way. But do you think that, and we can't really prove this, but it seems as though like the concept of sacrifice and how you said it may have been something that people came up with to feel better about the guilt, whatever. It just seems like this whole thing is like just cope. Like whether people like it just seems like you're just like, oh yeah, like I feel bad about this, so let's just come up with this entire like thing to make me feel better about it. Like I have my son has an exam this week. It's like, it seems like it just seems like cope, and maybe that sounds disrespectful to like other cultures, but like
and it's like 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 year old cope is what it is. I mean, it's been around for a long time, and the funny thing is like anyone who's listening to this that maybe does come from a Western religious background would hear what I'm saying and probably think, well, wait a minute, but there's animal sacrifice all throughout the Bible, so what do you have to say about that? But again, like I said, when you look at the scripture and you realize what the beginning of the story is and the ending of the story, where there is no slaughter of animals, you see that humanity devolves into that in the scriptures even. And these prophets come, and every single prophet in the Bible condemns animal sacrificial ritual. They say God never wanted this. So it's not something that me, Cam, in 2024 is just making up. This is in the text from thousands of years old, and the people that you know and love, like Isaiah, Hezekiah, Nehemiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, all of these different prophets were speaking out against this practice, which again, animal sacrificial ritual in that time was synonymous with animal agriculture, with the meat industry. It was the way the people in cities obtained their meat because they didn't have the resources to do it otherwise. People weren't running around eating hamburgers 2,000 years ago. They were eating a lot of grain or what they could cultivate in that area in the Holy Land, dates, carob, these kind of things. And it was very rare that they got the opportunity to kill and eat an animal because the resource intensity to raise an animal was a lot. And so that was more of like a wealthy thing to get that. So every year during these festival seasons, they would come together and the priests would all butcher the animals in this ritual, and then they would distribute the meat. The priests got the best cuts of meat and they got all the change and the money from being able to do it. So yeah, it's one of those things that we don't realize that animal sacrificial ritual is at the heart of the practices that we have today, just with the slaughterhouse down the road.
Livestock, as you said in the documentary as well, livestock and capitalism as we know it literally has its roots in that.
Yeah.
I get this so often that no one's stopping you from being vegan. No one's telling you what to do, but it's my personal choice. You eat whatever you want. You do whatever, you want to do. You don't have to tell me. Mm-hmm. I have agency. I've got, my own will. I can make my own choices. I live in a free society. How do you tackle that from an ethical, religious, spiritual point of view? But also, what's your most common response to these questions?
Yeah, I mean, for me, people act like the action of consuming animal products is a victimless choice. And it's interesting because in any other situation where somebody is abusing somebody else, we're not just like, this is my personal choice. It's like your personal choice not so personally includes the oppression of trillions of animals every year. So how can you, like, if I, let's say I like listening to like metal music and someone was like against that, I'm like, well, that's my personal choice. I personally I choose to, and that'd be a valid way to use that argument, whatever you want to call it. But eating animals and harming others should not be something that we just respect, just like we don't respect somebody who abuses a child or kicks a dog. If anybody said, it's my personal choice to kick this dog, it makes me feel good to kick dogs, we wouldn't be like, oh, true, it's chill, go for it. Like, so it's an interesting way to frame an action that is clearly not just like between you and yourself.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And I think, again, bringing it back to the spiritual, one of the biggest crux of the kind of Western religious ideology is that we have free will, that God granted us free will. And, the reasoning behind that is that, we can freely choose to love God and this and that, because if we couldn't, we'd just be robots, right? So the fact that we have free will to make those choices is so powerful. And don't we want to yield that in the best way possible? Don't we realize that our free will and our choices have impact? And if they impact another's life, who in its own way has its own agency, it has its own desires, it has its own, just want to exist and live and enjoy life. That's the most, I think, anti-freedom thing that you can do.
People often say that vegans need to live and let live. When you actually break down what they're saying they want vegans to live and let me not let others live. That's what's happening. And there's rhetoric that people use. That's a great example.
That's a good one. I've never really thought of that. That's funny.
I actually came up with it.
Good job.
The prophet, Daniel.
Live and let kill.
Can you just live and let me kill others? Like, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
But
That's what it is, though. You're right.
Yeah. Like, live and let me not let others live. It's the most, it's just like there's like a contradiction even in there,
It's completely antithetical to the, precept and commandment at the center of every religion, which is thou shalt not kill.
Yeah. So I think that's like probably like the quickest, snappy way to address it. And
because it should be a unifier, right? Rather than something that is so divisive and we're so hated for that vegans are extreme. We have a cult, we have this, but all we're trying to do is just tell people that you don't need to exploit animals for the way we live right now. Because I see it coming together as like this commonality between like religion, science, logic, whatever that might be, all school of thought. So we could just agree that we can all live in the 21st century without exploiting animals. Right. I feel like that should literally be.
Well, the irony too about considering it, veganism or not wanting to harm animals or being an animal rights activist or whatever as being a part of a cult. That's a lot of people say that, and the irony of that. Again, animal sacrifice, literally in theological terminology, the priests who killed the animals for sacrifice, they were called the sacrificial cult. It's known as a cult ritual. So it's literally a cult ritual to maim and abuse and kill animals. And in fact, if you look at the animal rights movement, vegan movement, et cetera, you will see an insane eclectic mix of people, which lends to the idea that it's not a cult, because usually cults homogenize people. But like, Daniel's an atheist. I have a Christian, upbringing, still follow Christ. I've met people from
agnostic, to be clear.
Agnostic.
But
right. Okay.
Yeah.
But you see people of all shapes and sizes, backgrounds, predispositions. There's people on politically on the conservative side of the spectrum. There's people on the progressive side of the spectrum. There's people all over that can agree with this, which definitely alludes to the fact that it's not a cult. It's just people trying to come to a logical conclusion.
If it's a cult, it's like the most divided cult ever, because from everything you said,
Yeah.
It has become politicized, though. It has become almost like the way climate change is a Democrat and a Republican thing, which was I think the first time someone ever spoke about climate change was actually a Republican. He was a Republican, but now it's become like a whole Democrat thing. Point, I think that's what it is, that we're all like these lefty hippies who want to liberate animals and do whatnot. So I think that's a perception it has, at least.
Yeah.
Do you believe in a vegan world? Do you think we can get to a vegan world?
I believe that we have to move forward as if we are, again, like reflecting on my tradition and my texts that I grew up loving and reading, the Bible, that the Eden is the ideal, and that we should, whether it's something, that we look to in the past as this ideal, or something that we look to in the future, as the Bible says, with the kingdom of heaven. I believe that it's something we have to move towards. I think that, I'm inspired by ideas like critical mass theory, 100th monkey theory, this idea that any given species once a certain amount of individuals in that species develop a trait, then they all miraculously, have you heard of this theory before? So there's a study, it's called, like, one of the best examples is 100th monkey theory. And there were these scientists that were observing, I think chimpanzees or apes, one of the two, in the jungle. And there was a particular individual chimpanzee that started washing the potatoes that the scientists were giving them for food in the river close by. It would wash it first and then eat it. And then a few days later, they noticed there were like 3, 4, 5. And then there was like 10, and they all started learning from each other to wash potatoes. But then one day, all the chimpanzees in the area started washing the potatoes, and they were observing and realized that there were certain chimpanzees that were washing the potatoes that had never interacted with another chimpanzee that was washing it. So it didn't learn that trait. And that's given rise to all of these theories like morphogenetic resonance, which is, again, this idea that there's this critical mass. Once a certain percentage of a population adopts a trait, everyone does, like wildfire. So that critical mass is said to be around 10% of the population. And we have, cities in the world that are getting close. London fluctuates between 5 to 6% vegan population, I think. Same thing with Tel Aviv, Israel. And so the closer and closer we get to that, the more I do feel that there's a potentiality of it, spreading like wildfire. And the fun part about that critical mass theory, though, too, is that it's not just that everyone has to be vegan, or 10% of the world population has to stop killing animals for food. It's that 10% of the population just has to believe that the world could go that direction. And including in that 10%, it could be people that are scared of it going that way. So imagine like a animal agriculture lobbyist all of a sudden looking at statistics and what's happening in the world and going, oh my gosh, it looks like the world could go vegan or plant-based or stop killing animals. If they're exhibiting that trait or fear, they're believing that that could happen. And in some ways, people who theorize on critical mass, they say that contributes to that 10%. So kind of interesting too. The more we just get the conversation going, even if it's opposing, the more we're snowballing towards that goal.
Yeah, I mean, I hope for a vegan world, but I don't know any sort of justice movement that has been expressed in some sort of global way. I mean, we still live in a world with racism, sexism, etc. So
homophobia, everything.
Right. So we haven't really gotten like global with any of the things that we've been pushing for, but of course that's the goal. And even if we never get to a globally non-racist world or non-homophobic world, it still matters that on an individual basis, especially when it comes to veganism, that people go vegan, because you have an effect on the market. There's this thing called supply and demand. The more demand there is for a product, the more supply. And supply in this case is animals that are bred into existence and killed and who suffer as well. So that's the goal, global, vegan world. But whether we'll get there or not, I think cultured meat is going to largely facilitate that. But we'll just keep pushing for it until we hopefully get there.
Well, I was just going to add to that, because I agree that's a great point, that we have all these other social injustices that still aren't fully solved yet. But the one thing I will say is I truly feel, whether or not we get there, I think that understanding this critical injustice is going to have a snowball effect on those other injustices as well. Because as we explore in Christpiracy, the way we abuse animals and discriminate against them is like a root cause issue that sets us up to discriminate against other human beings and do unjustifiable things as well, which still exists in the world. So if we can bring it down to the lowest common denominator and at least just treat animals in that respect, there's a good chance that it would actually have a butterfly effect of sorts on the other social justice issues.
With the existence of things like anthropocentric bias or having like a bias toward your species, it's hard to imagine how we would have things like racism and sexism when people don't have those kind of discriminatory reservations about animals who are not even their own species. So
Yeah, you're so right about that, because it has its roots in patriarchy. We, even capitalism essentially is patriarchal in the, oppression, extraction, all of those things. And in the dairy industry or meat industry, it's usually the female animal that's, oppressed or raped as well. So there is that connection between sexism, feminism, and veganism as well. And it's all intersectional.
Yeah, and I'm by no means like particularly against capitalism. I mean, I believe in free market, people having the ability to build their lives and those kind of things. But the irony is what is our current system of, quote unquote capitalism built on? It's inherently built off the backs of the exploitation of living beings. And it's literally in the word capitalism or capital. It comes from cap, the head of the animal, because in ancient societies, herding cultures measured their wealth in terms of heads of animals that they had in their particular villages or tribes. And so the idea of what we have as quote unquote modern day capitalism is flawed in the sense that it's built on the exploitation of others. And so I do believe there's a version of innovation and exploration and people being rewarded for their efforts and all those kind of things, but those rewards don't need to be at the expense of someone else's demise.
Yeah, I also think from a sustainability perspective, an infinite growth model of capitalism is problematic on a finite planet in terms of resources. So there needs to be some kind of limitations set out, as opposed to one where we just kind of let it just happen with no regard for the fact that we have a limited amount of resources on the planet. So
yeah.
If you had to redefine or rephrase veganism, how would you do it?
Redefine or rephrase? That's a good question. Yeah, I think we're often limited by that word because it's so triggering to people. I don't really use it a whole lot just in my everyday life and language with other people because of that fact. I tend to go through the back door and just talk to people about compassion, about freedom. But yeah, I think if I could redefine it, I just think, well, from my particular perspective, because I'm so passionate about people of the world religions, specifically mine, Christianity, clicking on this, I just hope people see it as like being human, being optimally humane. The word humane and human, that's where our name comes from. So I think just being optimally humane beings is how I would love to redefine it. But I also don't mind the V word. I think it does a good job at explaining what we're doing.
Yeah, if I can go back in time and like change the word vegan and veganism to something else, it'd probably be something like sentientism, or if you fall under sentientism, you're a sentientist. And I think that we can intuit what that means, just a value for sentient life. This has nothing to do with somebody being inherently human, but them being sentient, which at the end of the day, that's what veganism is trying to capture. Is that doesn't matter how you look. The fact that you're sentient, you have a capacity for well-being and suffering, should lend you the right to be free from suffering and being killed for a hamburger, etc. But in terms of the vegan society's definition, I do think there can be some utilitarian suffering reduction interpretations of it. So the current working definition from the Vegan Society is something along the lines of veganism is a lifestyle which seeks to exclude, as far as is practicable and practicable, all forms of cruelty to animals, and the whole like seeks to exclude as far as practicable and practicable. That whole part seems very ambiguous. Like there's a lot of debate in the vegan community as to what does that mean. And for me, I think I would take a more rights-based approach at defining veganism and just say it's very simply. And there's two versions I think of. There's just veganism as a doctrine by which we reject the exploitation of animals. I think that's a bit more straightforward. Or something like veganism is the logical extension of human rights to animal rights, and in that definition, human rights to be defined as how we currently define them. Like the right to be free from murder, unjustified exploitation, things like that. But the definition thing, I've kind of, at this point, I just kind of describe to people what I mean when I utter the word vegan, and ask if they agree with that or not, and then we have a nice back and forth. I don't know. There could be a lot of utility in like redefining it, but I'm at a point where I just have my discussions with people one-on-one, and hope to convince them that at the very least, what we do to animals, exploiting and killing them for trivial purposes is wrong, and we should seek to no longer do that.
Okay. Is there anything about each other's narratives that y'all don't agree on?
I'm sure. Yeah, but I'm not going to bring it up because he's got bigger muscles than me. So.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Uh-huh.
For now. But wait till I catch up with you.
Yeah.
I've been working on movies, editing too long, but I'm going to...
Well, I edit every day, so I don't know what the excuse is.
He's using logic now.
Yeah.
See, now that there's a beginning of a disagreement.
Exactly.
Right, there you go.
Exactly.
Yeah.
One myth you debunk forever, super quickly.
Sure. You do not need to consume animal products to be healthy, and this could be seen in the health outcomes of the Adventist vegetarians, who also many of which were vegan. There's a paper where they actually compare the meat eaters in that population to the vegetarians, to the vegans, to the pescatarians, and this is a religious group. I'm sure you're aware of them.
Mm-hmm.
They don't smoke, they don't drink, so you're comparing apples to apples in this case. A lot of people will say that you can't compare vegans to meat eaters because meat eaters tend to consume large amounts of meat, like processed meat, and they smoke and they drink. But in this paper, if you look at the actual health outcome data and the rates of mortality, vegans did fantastic. And I think there's other research too. But if I had to cite one paper, I think that's one of the greatest pieces of data we have to support the notion that you can in fact be vegan and be healthy.
Is this one you're gonna flex? Is this your moment too?
Oh, I mean, I don't like to rely on anecdotes, but as you can see, also I have musculature that has not been removed or gone down since going vegan. As I said before, it's gone up, not because I went vegan, but it at least has not been mitigated in any way. And I get 150 grams to 200 grams of protein per day. So, yeah.
I'm going to rely somewhat on an anecdote, and that's because I have a lot of myths that I'd love to bust, but most of them are in Christpiracy, and I don't want to give away any spoilers because I've already shared quite a lot. But I'll just let myself be an example as a myth being busted, that a barbecue eating, hunting, fishing, Southern conservative family raised, Bible beating Christian can come to the realization that maybe there's something else that God had in order for our connection with animals, make a shift and change and live to tell about it and feel great. And I'm still who I was before that. I just have a greater circle, I think, of compassion and understanding and empathy in a particular kind of way. And I think that a lot of times there's this idea that from my sphere and that kind of world that I come from, that if you start to question and consider these kind of things, that you'll wind up some woo-woo or maybe skinnier or maybe emaciated, all these things. But I'm here and I'm really excited to be where I'm at and to learn what I've learned, especially, the particular material of what's in the film Christpiracy.
I do want to also say that you do not need to be an animal lover to be a vegan. When I went vegan, I was not by any means an animal person. I just had an issue with suffering, and I understood from a perspective of logical consistency that it could not justify what animals go through in a way that it was logically consistent with my position on human rights. Nowadays, after adopting a cat 6 or 7 months ago, I think I'm slowly becoming an animal lover, but you do not need to be one. You do not need to be one to just grant them rights. There's also people that quote, hate humans, but they still don't hear about innocent people dying and be like, oh, that's great. Yeah. So there's, yeah.
All right. My last question to both of you is, what does sustainability mean to you?
You go first.
Go ahead. Whoever wants to take that.
Well, so sometimes sustainability is just a buzzword. I feel, that people slap on labels to make people, again, feel good about what they're consuming. But yeah, I think true sustainability is being a part of a truly regenerative system. I don't even know that I like the word sustain, because sustaining is one thing, but actually growing and building towards more and more abundance for others and yourself and everyone is actually the goal. And unfortunately, the regenerative agriculture movement has claimed that term before I think the non-animal product users got to it. But really, when you're talking about the environment, there's nothing more regenerative, sustainable, but I prefer regenerative than the fact that you can pick a fruit from a tree and it's got seeds within it. You enjoy this beautiful, sweet, decadent treat. It's pleasing on the eyes and all of its colors and all these things. And then right there, the tree that you picked it from continues to live and grow and provide shade for birds and all these other things. And you can grow infinitely more of those same trees from the thing that you're eating. Same thing, same thing, but different with, you pick a carrot out of the ground. That's literally a root. I used to think that was killing the plant, but you can actually cut the carrot, you can consume the carrot, and you can put the shard back in the ground and regrow the carrot. So it's truly regenerative. Whereas, you can't pluck a limb off of an animal and consume it and the limb grow back, or, plant an animal and grow more.
Yeah, and I like your reconstruction of the definition of the word sustainable, because strictly just sustainable would just mean like you're sustaining a system, but we'd want one that expands and grows. So yeah, it's going to be something along the lines of a system acting in accordance with say being able to support itself over the long term in a way that can also support expansion. And something like animal agriculture, which takes up like 70 to 80% of our land and supplies like 15 to 20% of our calories, is not sustainable. If the entire world were to, for example, go carnivore, we would need like 3 Earths, which is like not okay. Like, how are we going to do that? Yeah. So, but when it comes to plant agriculture, when you're growing plants and you're just eating them after they're grown, as opposed to taking them, giving them to an animal, and then getting on average about 10% of the calories back in the form of animal products, that is not sustainable. Like it's actually one of the it's just one of the dumbest things I've ever heard of.
It's not regenerative, it's degenerative.
Right.
Like often these animal-based regenerative agriculture movements, they're calling themselves the regen movement, but I actually call it the degen movement because it's not really, it's literally degenerating landscapes, eroding topsoil when
and people argue that if we all went vegetarian or vegan, we wouldn't be able to survive. They're like, oh, what would happen to the land, biodiversity, all of that. And I don't even know.
We'd be using less land, so I don't even know where that comes from. And also, one of the quote best studies on regenerative agriculture on white oak pastures in Georgia found that compared to conventional animal agriculture, which I said before, already takes up 75% of our agricultural land to provide 15 to 20% of our calories, that form of farming takes up 2.5 times more land. Mm-hmm. So we actually don't even have enough habitable land to even adopt their systems globally. So it's just there's no good reason to think that regenerative animal agriculture is sustainable. Same with the grass-fed pasture stuff. And by the way, that's not to say that plant-based agriculture cannot be improved.
Right.
There's such thing as regenerative plant-based agriculture, which
veganic
farming. Yeah. And so these are if we're going to take an alternative.
Veganic farming is a movement that seeks to not have any animal inputs, because you could grow quote unquote vegan food, but actually use like manure from animals as fertilizer and such. But there's actually a movement of veganic, which doesn't utilize that, to show that nitrogen fixation and all of these types of things can actually be done from chop and drop from plants, that you don't even need animal inputs. Because people will argue, well, we need these farm animals to keep the soil going to be able to produce enough food.
We actually already use there's like manure, but then there's also artificial fertilizer. But there's alternatives like green manure, for example. Mm-hmm. So that's just there's plenty of alternatives to current like industrial plant agriculture that we can explore. But the point is that alternatives to industrial animal agriculture, they take up more land, they emit more greenhouse gas emissions, and the idea that they sequester enough carbon to offset the amount of carbon and other emissions being emitted by cows is just a myth. And this can be determined by just reviewing the paper I cited on white oak pastures, which found that they only reduced emissions by 66%, not 100%, or even like having like a -%, which would imply a carbon negative, where they're actually able to bring like not only offset what they currently are emitting, but even more so. Yeah. So it's
and the farmer and founder of White Oak will admit, I've heard him say point blank that this isn't for everyone, that the world couldn't do this, that we can't move this system everywhere, because he knows just from a land use perspective that we just don't have enough land for it. And so I think that the challenge and the issue is that a lot of people get this regenerative buzzword, grass-fed, et cetera, and they think that they're eating that, but there's no way to sustain the amount of meat consumption we have on planet Earth and do it that way. However, again, coming back to that question of what is truly sustainable, I think if you, we do need to improve plant agriculture. And I think moving to systems like food forestry, agroforestry is so exciting and powerful because you've got layers of potentiality of what you're able to grow on particular land. If you've got a pasture raising cows, you've basically got one output coming out of that land, and that's the cow meat. There's not much more that you're producing there. However, if you take that same plot of land and you put trees that grow fruits first, now you've got trees all producing, but the yield of that tree is actually in the sky. Then you've got vines of grapes and things that you can grow around the stalks of the trees. And now you're using those verticals to grow. So you're actually increasing the land use, hypothetically speaking, by growing trees first and then growing other vegetables and fruits and different bushes and such in between them. So you're maximizing the use of that
The
land.
visual I had in my head was the public transportation system, the number of cars versus the number of buses and how many people those can hold, right? Buses have the capacity of like holding 100, 200 people versus the same amount of cars, like 20, it'd be like 20 cars.
Yeah.
That's like 20
That's a good
people.
analogy,
So that's like literally the visual I got in my head. And it's also the calorie inefficiency. Because I think a chicken eats about 9 calories and gives you 1. I think it's 1:9, if I'm not wrong. So I think it's also the calorie inefficiency.
Totally.
It's something I wanted to say in response to what you mentioned about the people that say we need their fertilizer, which we don't. But even if we did, I always ask these people, so why don't we just have these animals take their manure but not kill them? And they usually never have a response to that. They just and to me that suggests that they're really just motivated to eat meat at the end of the day, which requires killing them. So.
Totally.
All right. Where can people find you, support the work that you do?
Well, the film Christpiracy can be found across all social media platforms at Christpiracy. You can follow for updates there. The film is going to be live digital through a pay it forward model at Christspiracy.com. Along with all kinds of extra content, and we're going to be building into the future. But the film itself will be freely accessible to everyone in many, many languages. Actually, we already have like 5 or 6 languages translated, and we're shooting for more as long as we can get the support over time from those who pay it forward. So Christpiracy.com at Christspiracy across all social media.
Also, one reason why people should watch the documentary.
It's going to completely transform and rewrite history to reveal what was always there. And I think that whether you're a Christian, a Buddhist, a Hindu, or even if you're agnostic or atheist, this film is mind-blowing and will reveal something that is undeniable, and you have to see it. You have to see it. It's going to reshape again history. There's a lie that we've been told for far too long about our cultural traditions and our ethical traditions, and this film gets to the root at that. And yeah, it's time. It's a film whose time has come. And I think too, just to add on to that, if you are religious, every 500 years there's a massive reformation in specifically religious ideology. And the last one that happened was the Great Reformation, they call it. And it was 508 years ago. So we're actually 8 years overdue. So I truly believe that this film is a part of a massive awakening that's going to happen with ethical, religious, spiritual tradition.
As someone who's seen it, I can vouch for that 100%.
Same as an agnostic, so.
That carries more weight coming from you.
Right.
Yeah, but it was mind-blowing in every sense of it. Yeah.
100%. Yeah, and you can find me on Instagram at my ad is at lifting_vegan_logic on Twitter or X now. It's at vegan_logic. And then on YouTube, it's lifting vegan logic. And then on TikTok, it's at lifting_vegan_logic. And yeah, I think while veganism is an animal rights based thing, there's so many indirect benefits of it in terms of health, the environment, pandemic risk, antibiotic resistance, and even other things. So I think it's one of the most important things that people should be discussing. And you don't need to be politically left or right to get on board with it. Opposing animal abuse is just, to me, it's just a very basic like principle that I think most people agree with. They just don't realize that their decisions actually fund such abuse. So yeah, that's all I have to say.
If I could just endorse Danny's channel too, as someone who
You have to do that for each other. That's
yeah,
what
well, I
yeah.
tend to, I try to like avoid social media as much as I can, and often I'm so busy with the film and everything that that I don't follow as many people, and he's one of the ones that's really consistent for me, because even if you're new to this whole conversation, but you just like a good laugh, you like good satire and everything, that's Danny's flavor. And you never open up his channel and don't get a laugh out of it.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
At minimum, at least go there for the laughs.
Yeah, I get a lot of meat eaters that message me saying that they laugh at the content, because I do like satire and whatnot and skits. And then from what I've seen, a good amount of them over time end up hearing the more serious side of animal rights from my messaging and start, either reducing their consumption of animal products or full-blown going vegan. So I think there is a bit of a humor gap in the vegan community, and I try to fill it, and without being cringe, So
it's great. Humor is disarming, and it's
it's lower defenses, I think.
Yeah. I heard and I know we got to wrap up soon, but I just wanted to share this with you. Something deep that I learned recently was that the act of laughter, especially in a communal setting, is subconscious emotional signal to other humans that you understand each other.
Really?
Because I forget who was breaking it down, but it was this really beautiful kind of idea that, like, in a comedy club, for instance, when people break out into laughter, that ecstatic moment is a moment when everybody realizes that they're not alone, and it's actually deeply cohesive and has all these benefits and everything. And I think that it breaks down those walls, because someone says the thing that no one was supposed to say, but everyone was feeling. And so you're kind of breaking down those barriers and allowing people to maybe think differently about thoughts that they have.
Yeah, I make fun of anti-vegan argumentation, and then meat eaters laugh at my presentation of it, and they're probably just like, it's probably some underlying, like, I agree with you. Yeah, that was a really stupid argument that they're making. And so
he said all of those nice things was because he's scared of your muscles. He said that already. You're just like bigger than him.
That's okay.
But thank you so much for what both of you do. As I said, troublemakers, but for the right reason. I know you've had people follow you. There's been like death threats. You get a lot of backlash, all of those things, but you still keep fighting for the animals. And it takes a lot of courage to do that. So I do want to acknowledge the work that both of you do for this movement, for the planet, for the animals, all of that. So thank you. And thank you for doing this with me.
Yep, thank you for having me. And Cam, he's great. Everyone go follow him.
Yeah. And go watch the documentary.
Yeah.
Yes.
Definitely.
Yes.
Number one.
It'll be out soon.
Yeah, very soon.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's already out by the time this.
Yeah, I think it will be.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. You can.
Thanks.